Hello everyone. Thanks for joining today's SAP community call. This is Svea Becker from the SAP community team, and I'm here today with Marta Velasco. I hope I spelled it correctly. I pronounced it correctly, because Marta is actually from Spain, but you might have thought as of her name, but she has grown up in Belgium, and that gave her the possibility to learn a lot of different languages. And this is really good for her job at SAP, because she is currently an intern at SAP, and she studies politics at the University of Bath. And now she's working for SAP in pre-sales. And I'm really happy to have her here today, because it's not the first time I met her. I met her a few weeks ago in March at the SAP Inside Track in Maidenhead. And there I thought this is really a great opportunity to get this nice presentation from Marta to the audience of the community. And that's the reason why she's here today. And hello, Marta, and thanks very much for having you here today in the subcommittee call.
Hello everyone. Thank you so much, Svea, for the opportunity to present this topic. It's actually something I'm very, very interested in and started researching when I first started my placement last July. So it's a topic that I'm gonna do research in back at university when I return in October for my dissertation. So there'll be a small survey that will follow the presentation takes about 3 to 4 minutes with about 10 questions. It's not really feedback, it's just your own opinions on the topic of generational intelligence in the workplace. So let's get started.
Yeah, that sounds very interesting.
Yeah. Is it okay to begin?
You can start, of course.
I realize I'm not sure I can actually ask questions here, but I will include them in the survey.
Yeah. So from the technical side, the attendees cannot talk. Everyone is on mute, but they have the possibility to ask a question. So they are able to raise their hand on the right side in the participant pane, and then the other possibility would be then I can unmute them. The other possibility would be to write it in the chat on the right-hand side, and I will monitor the chat during the presentation, so you can go ahead with it.
Okay, no problem. That sounds good. Well, usually I'd ask if anyone has heard of generational intelligence. Most people tend to say that they haven't, but maybe some of you have. You can let me know in your surveys afterwards. So it's quite an important topic now, especially because we work with 5 different generations around us every day. So we'll go through these during the presentation, so I won't give it away right now. But just before we begin, it's really important to keep in mind that every generation that surrounds us every day brings its own view of the world, which creates both opportunities and threats to the business. So it's essential that we all think how we can tackle these issues for our own teams and how they can be beneficial and not see them in a negative way. So I know that a lot of people have felt before not understood by someone else in their team, whether this is a difference in time, generation, or just area. But whether this has happened with parents or kids or colleagues, I'm pretty sure you've all felt misunderstood by another generation before. So this is something that I'm going to explain today, and we're going to try and tackle together. So the main reason why I think this topic is important is because we as humans have naturally grown up forming part of our own generation. And so we see it kind of as our own house. It's our safe area. And even though it's a great house, we shouldn't all stay within it. So it's really important that you try and leave your natural kind of comfort zone ways of your generation in order to not miss out on the fact that there are other houses to see just around the corner, which can also bring different ideas that you may not have thought of. So it's important that you move forward and let yourself be influenced, as well as leading and learning from others. So with this said, we're going to start by simply just stating, what we'll go through in the presentation. So what is generational intelligence, which I've sort of described right now? Simply the awareness of the fact that there are at least 4 types of generational groups around you on a daily basis. I do know for a fact, because from my time at SAP, I've realized that all of these generations I work with every day. So multi-generations at work. So what does this actually mean, and who are these people? Who are these generations? Attracting the new workforce. So this will target young talent such as myself. So to just state, this is called the Generation Z. So people born between 1998 until today. Then we're going to compare a few generations. I've chosen 2 in specific, which I've noticed during my time at the office tend to suffer a little more when working together. You can all obviously tell me if you disagree or agree with this. And then managing multi-generational teams. So this is just a little bit of my own advice from my experience during this year, and how I've managed to, as a young talent and as an intern, to kind of tackle the fact that I had to work with very different generational mindsets to my own. So this is what we'll go through today. Just to begin with, we're simply going to go through the first generation, so the traditionalists. Believe it or not, there are still about 3% of our workforce which is represented by traditionalists. So these are people, as you can see, born between 1928 and 1945, so the years of World War II and the Great Depression. So these people are obviously characterized by hardworking people. They obviously didn't have great experience most of their lives, so they may tend to be more pessimistic in general. They are obviously very respectful and very disciplined due to their surroundings. They're known as the veterans and also the silent generation. That's obviously for a reason, due to the main events that define them. So every single generation, as we go through them, will be defined by 2 or 3 main events. They obviously all follow rules. They're quite loyal to their workplace. So unlike my generation, we tend to, or at least from what I've seen, we tend to move, we're not as loyal to one company, so we tend to move around in order to achieve personal development, rather than stay loyal to one workplace. And one of their very famous sentences, which defines them, is "a penny saved is a penny earned." So I thought this was a sentence that really defined their mindset, and it's important to keep in mind that they're quite money orientated due to their experiences. So this is important to keep in mind when we look at the motives of each generation at work. Then our second ones are the baby boomers, which came just after, so 1947 to 1964. These are people between 53 and 70 years old. They form a bigger part of the workforce. So their defining events are the Vietnam War. They were kind of known as the first to do anything. So the moon landing, the women's rights, the first time that pop rock came out. So they're the rebellious ones. They're the ones that kind of broke the rules for the rest of the generations to come. They're known as innovative, and their main sentence that I think describes them is that they live to work. They're quite passionate about what they do, and they simply want to be the first one to discover something. So they are, in my opinion, the affirmative kind of action babies from what I've said, and the architects of today's millennials. They love talking in the workplace, and they're in a hurry to kind of go further than the rest of the workforce. So I just have a short video for all of you now. It's a documentary actually, and it's available on Netflix. It's called The Boomer List, I think. I've watched the whole thing and I definitely recommend it. It's simply about 8 to 10 famous American, some of them are actors, but some of them are simply speakers and are known for doing something for the first time, as I mentioned. I don't want to give anything away. So I'm just gonna play it now. You can give me some feedback in the chat if you'd like. And it's just to give you a gist of what a baby boomer mindset kind of looks like. So I'm just gonna play it now. I hope you can all hear it. If not, Svea, please let me know.
Yes,
We were
it works.
my whole neighborhood was prime for a race war. Disco happened, and then you started edging into hip hop and breakdancing.
I had to go through a period of rebellion. I got arrested. If we stood up for what we believed, we were thought of as being difficult or a bitch.
We go to like a fancy restaurant, and they would put us all the way in the back, and my father goes, because of your afro. They didn't look like movie stars. They were from Liverpool, which is even a worse sounding name than Hicksville. That was, King, Kennedy, and Jesus. The pictures on the wall. And I tried my first LSD experiment.
You feel like you're falling because, in fact, you actually are in free fall. What a radical idea that sex was healing.
All my friends have their clothes off, and they're all in these Renaissance poses.
And I wanted all my life to be a part of a revolution.
We thought that we could rule the world.
I was shocked to find that certain people had swimming pools in their backyard, and I was thinking, well, I want to live like that.
The new face of poverty or economic insecurity is that of a working woman.
What is existence? And then how come we know that we exist?
I know what's right and I know what's wrong.
I thought there was a mandatory retirement age in rock and roll. Obviously, there isn't. Pursuit of happiness. How about pursuit of just making it through the damn day, you know what I mean?
Okay, so I'm hoping that everyone could hear that. That was simply to give you a little gist of how they think. So obviously we can tell that there was kind of a positive outburst after our traditionalist main events. So I hope you watched the documentary. I actually had a really good time watching it, and it's very, very accurate, I must say.
We were
So,
my whole neighborhood.
just not to watch it again. Here we go. So our next generation that I quickly want to go through is the Generation X. This is the second biggest generation at the workforce at the moment. So born between 1965 and 1980, so they represent the 37 to 52-year-olds. Their main events were the fall of the Berlin Wall and the Gulf War. And they are known as the first to move away from home, to put it that way. They were the first to maybe start their family life not in their hometown. So families no longer all lived in the same place, and their children found it quite hard to identify what was known as home. They're famous for being very independent and wanting to work on their own. So this is something that you could keep in mind when you're next in a meeting or working with a Gen Xer. I know I do. And then they like to go away and brainstorm on their own and get the work done by themselves, whereas millennials, which we will look at after, tend to come into the room full of ideas and ready to collaborate and talk to the Gen Xers, which are simply have a tendency to push them away. And this is where I found that there was a bit of conflict, which we'll look into more detail afterwards. So they are also the TV generation, speaking technology-wise. So they're quite visual, and they do more with less and say more with less. So we've gone from a mindset of live to work to work to live. So they are more dedicated to their work. And even though they're more flexible and inclusive, they're a lot more money orientated than baby boomers. So hence the work to live kind of quote for their generation. Then to continue, this is our biggest generation in the workforce right now. So the Gen Y or Millennials, they're known as both. You've probably heard the word millennial more. They were born in between 1981 and 1998. So the 19 to 36-year-olds. So as you can see, there's a lot of young talent within that generation as well, even though we've got another one coming up, which represents the fifth one. So the event which defines them is actually 9/11. As I said earlier, when describing the Gen Xers, they're very team-orientated and value collaboration. So they like working together. They don't enjoy going back and reflecting it on their own. They like to speak out their ideas. They're definitely the multitaskers between all generations and have revolutionized technology, which I will show you in just a second. And they require immense amounts of feedback. So an example of this is the rates in interview feedback for millennials are a lot higher in comparison to other generations. It's been shown that a millennial which gets rejected by a company after an interview is much likely to ask for feedback in comparison to a Gen Xer or baby boomer. So with all this in mind, I'm just gonna show you a few examples of millennials. So before I show you these, the important thing to keep in mind is that millennials basically revolutionized how we live today by making us fully transparent. And they've created their own way of entertainment and sort of even way of living through technology. And with this, what I mean is that, well, obviously through Facebook, our lives have become transparent. Then we've got the creators of Uber, Instagram, and Snapchat, which together have made us basically connected humans. We've all come to live in a way where we have the need to feel connected all the time. So this includes Facebook, this includes Uber, Snapchat, and Instagram. We all have the need now to feel connected. Obviously, some generations more than others. But these guys have revolutionized how we live, how we travel, how we speak, how we organize events, and how we communicate. So they're kind of the turning point. And some of the best minds in business today are actually millennials who've achieved massive success and fame. So they are also known as the big adapters from all generations. They've made things easier for our modern day family and our kids. And most of them also find it hard to identify home. So just to go through our very last generation before we go into how to tackle working with all of these generations together. Gen Z, which is myself, is born between 1999 and present day. So we represent about 2% of the workforce at the moment, and most of us are obviously interns. So we're, as I said, probably the most connected generation there is. We are actually addicted to being connected. I think none of us know how to be on our own, and I think that's that issue for my generation. So we have very high expectations. By this, what I mean is that, for instance, if we lose something or if we try to achieve a goal and it doesn't happen, we tend to react in a more extreme manner than other generations, because we're very used to being able to research things when we want to, have answers when we want to, and be able to buy things when we want to, whether that's in a store or at home. So we are usually given things quite easily. So we have very high expectations of life in general. We're very materialistic, as I've just said. So also quite optimistic, as we haven't really been defined by any extreme event yet. And we're also quite strategic, but also unfortunately very competitive. And we need not as much feedback, but a lot of validation and gratification. And this issue mainly comes from social media. So the fact that there are a lot of famous people on social media that are not actually actors or singers or famous globally, but simply famous for their platform, has made us people who need validation and gratification from others online. And I will show you what I mean by this. So for instance, this is a simple slide showing you what I think you should know when it comes to knowing your audience. So for instance, Teo Lopez, he's a simple entrepreneur, but he's an online entrepreneur. So he works with $20 million businesses as an investor, partner, consultant, and advisor. He uses the internet to motivate people and businesses towards financial success, conducts a business mentorship program of his own. And that's his form and way of self-learning about businesses without going through the whole university degree or any masters whatsoever. He uses Instagram in particular as his platform for promotional purposes. So at the moment, as you can see, he's giving away 10K cars and laptops, certainly paid by a company. which promotes them through his social media network because of all his followers. So this is just a way to represent what our audience looks like today and where influence is really coming from. This is really complex and important to understand for any company, in my opinion. And then we've got Megan, who's only 22 and has been using Instagram for about 6 years and is incredibly influential simply through her platform of talking only about food and life blog. So all of these influencers, I've only represented 3 here, but there are thousands and thousands, represent what our audience looks like today and what where our consumer influence is. So the problem with, well, not problem, but the thing to keep in mind today is that our influence doesn't come from celebrities anymore. So my generation doesn't really look for famous influence anymore. It goes to personalized platforms and unique influencers. So about 3% of the people that actually influence what we will buy, look at, or do are only 3%, whereas the people we actually look at and go to may be a simple peer who happens to be an influencer, and these represent about 30% of the people that influence my generation. So moving on, just some facts to show where the influence is at in the market at the moment. So the Influencer Marketing Hub conducted a study showing an increase in 325% of Google researches for influencer marketing in a year. So this influencer marketing statistic indicates the growing popularity of this marketing strategy, as we can see on these in this graph. So in the same study, influencer collaborations were ranked number 1 at being the fastest online customer acquisition method, and 28% of respondents ranked it as the first position. So the study reveals obviously that influencer marketing is twice as fast in acquiring customers than organic searches, for instance. So it is also 10 times more effective than affiliate marketing in new customer acquisitions, which are online. And we now know how to attract them. But how valuable is this influence really is our question, and whether companies should invest in it. So to answer that question, I looked in a little further, and I found out that for every dollar, so every pound, for instance, spent on influencer campaigns, companies are earning $7.65 on average. And some companies are even earning more than $12 for every dollar spent on an influencer. So 57% of the respondents have said that they have a standalone budget for content marketing, which means that companies are putting money aside to acquire some of these influencers. And also 37% of markets in the survey said that they set aside extra budgets now for influencer marketing too. So it is an actual fact. And just to show the clear statistics of each generation. So as I mentioned earlier, very briefly when I was presenting them, our traditionalists on the left in blue represent 3% of our current workforce. The baby boomers in pink represent about 34%, so 41 million people in our workforce. Then we've got our Gen Xers, 29%, then the biggest bit of our workforce, so the Millennials, which represent 38%, and the Gen Zs, which are the latest generation, which only represent 1% at the moment. So this is where I wanted to compare the two generations, which I think clash the most. So the Millennials and the baby boomers, as I mentioned earlier, have quite a different mindset. So boomers' careers were formed within kind of a hierarchical landscape where the flow of information was restricted, whereas millennials are very much transparent and born into generations full of transparency, including Facebook, They expect information immediately and are also willing to answer a lot of basic details in order to, for instance, just connect to Wi-Fi. They obviously reject traditional top-down communication. That's the millennials. And it's really important to understand how millennials and baby boomers like to communicate in order to avoid this kind of conflict. So most baby boomers will like to receive news or policy changes within their company in person, whereas millennials would rather receive this electronically. And some advice for business leaders in the workplace today. So I would keep in mind that millennials are sometimes baby boomers' bosses. And in order for this to work, there must be effective communication and mutual respect between them. So how can we actually ensure this? At the end of the day, generations are more similar than different. So it's important to honor differences between these generations and use these to your advantages, and use the similarities when developing plans to recruit, retain, engage employees, and engage employees from different generations. So as I mentioned earlier, important to remember each generation's value. So how meaningful is work for them? What are their motives at work? Is it money? Is it flexibility? Is it genuine passion for for their role? So in order for this to work, it's very important to support and be aware of diversity, especially within the millennial generation, because it's increasingly diverse within the workplace. So this not only means accepting race and ethnicity, this also includes some examples of single parent homes, blended families, same-sex families, and this is in their normality, and therefore it's really important for more senior people to understand and support teams of all ages, genders, and cultures. So that's a little bit where there's a clash, obviously not a direct clash, but there is tension. I have experienced. And then another important point is loyalty and longevity of each generation within their own role. So what I mean by this is that when it comes to career, baby boomers see job security as the most important aspect. So therefore they'll secure their job and want to remain within the same one. Whereas millennials will obviously always prioritize career development over career security. And in turn, they value opportunities which will serve them in the long term over finding a better job somewhere else. So millennials are more likely to change jobs 2 or 3 times in about their 5 first years of work, which leads some of us obviously to view this generation as lacking in loyalty, but they are just as committed, simply that they are committed to a company for different reasons. So it's not money security, it's more the career security. So that's sort of what I wanted to say about these 2 generations. This is where I would like the most comments from everyone. And it's also where I have the most amount of questions in my survey about. So I hope to hear a little bit of feedback on that bit from everyone. So now to move on to generational values and motivations in the workplace, which I've briefly mentioned in a few of my other slides. But just to go into a bit more detail, it's very important to know what each generation actually wants. So one of Deloitte's surveys actually proved that 56% of millennials globally have rejected a certain company on the basis of its values. So millennials, to put it into context, crave meaningful work and want to feel they are contributing to their organization's mission. So they want more than just a paycheck. They value work-life balance, flexibility, and the chance to help others, but more over all of that, they value career development, as I mentioned earlier. So as we can see on my little graph that I just made very simple for all of you, they value their work-life balance. So this is for many reasons. Most millennial married couples, as a lot of Gen Xers and baby boomer ones, of course, are married working couples with children. So they tend to value them a lot more work-life balance than they value money or workplace values, even though diversity for them is a very important aspect as well, as I mentioned earlier. So this is really important. This is one of the most important graphs I could show you to keep in mind, especially for seniors and managers in the company. So for instance, even in interviews, we now also check if employees know the simple 5 values of SAP. And I know this for a fact because I've had to interview the intern that's replacing me. So this it goes to show that all the motives that that go by each generation are considered within the workplace, and it's important to keep them in mind, not only within your team, but also in terms of recruiting and forming your own team. So moving on to just a few facts. On the left, we've got a graph that shows us and emphasizes us a few of the motives of our generations, and same with the right. So when it comes to career, baby boomers see job security, as I mentioned earlier, as the most important aspect. So on the other hand, millennial employees are twice as likely to have a spouse, as I mentioned earlier as well, or a working partner. And so they are a lot more likely to value balanced and flexible hours at work than they are to value money or a nicer work environment. Even though those will also be important for them, other reasons will be above it. And for probably the most important slide, now that we know what each of our generations actually want and look for in their jobs, how do we manage this? How do we manage our team? So with this, I also mean, how do we attract them? Number one piece of advice from me as a researcher of the topic is to avoid stereotyping. So stereotyping means obviously unconscious bias, which I've seen everywhere. So to not judge the book by its cover. Because, for instance, I know that baby boomers will think millennials are tech obsessed and lack people skills. And then that Gen Zs will think that baby boomers are stubborn or inflexible. So all of these are really important to not follow. So by this, I can prove it through simple Google researches, where I know that traditionalists are named to be as future-oriented and reject globalization, which I know for a fact is not true because I worked with a traditionalist before and he did not reject globalization. Baby boomers are known as rude, obviously not sociopaths or any of that, but just to show a few stereotypes. Gen Xers are labeled as lazy. Millennials are labeled as silly, irrelevant things, but just to show how stereotypes can influence even Google. And Gen Zs, again, labeled as lazy, when I obviously disagree with that statement. So just very important to avoid stereotyping other generations. Then number two, to be flexible. So identify other generations' tics. And by this, I mean, keep in mind their values, keep in mind their motives that we went through, keep in mind how they work and how you could adapt to this, or how you could try and make them adapt to you. So, for instance, we'll know that silent generation may appreciate part-time work as they tend to be older. So by this, I mean, be smarter than others and try to adapt to them. It's like kind of going to work in a different country and learning the national language. This will be obviously to your advantage when your team feels more comfortable around you as a leader than someone else, because they can relate to you through language. So that's just a simple example. And keep in mind what we spoke about earlier. What does each generation look for? Are you talking to the sandwich generation, Gen Xers? Are you talking to the apparently tech-obsessed generation, millennials? Just keep in mind how they will think. And with that, make sure you tailor your communication. So learn to identify each generation's preferred ways of communication. So the silents and baby boomers prefer one-to-one telephone or written communication. So they prefer obviously more formal ways of communicating. So this entails that they have a more distant personality. Gen Xers and Gen Ys tend to like emails and texts, so more informal ways of communication. And Gen Zs will prefer the collaborative kind of interaction of social media, so quick and direct communication, and this allows them to feel constantly connected, which is what I said is probably our flaw. Then I'd also say, as my fourth point, do not overlook similarities between generations. So focus on the things that unite you and your team rather than focusing and maybe complaining about those things that differ you. Because I can say for a fact that research shows that there are more similarities than differences between generations, and just keep in mind that we're all 99.9% biologically the same. So that just goes to show. So obviously most of us simply want to feel engaged and rewarded by our role and want a better quality of life. So at the end of the day, we are all people and we will all have very similar needs. And lastly, to make a success of your team, you should always establish and work on establishing respect. So this is something we all crave from one another, no matter what age group we belong to. And just as newcomers, as myself, should respect those more experienced in the industry, senior generations need to also adapt and respect the young talent. So obviously the key that I think you should take away from the establishing respect is respecting other generations is obviously to accept that they are different. And as I explained earlier concerning the trainings of inclusivity and diversity that SAP has online helps us with this. And this includes everything that I mentioned about motivations, expectations of each generation, and what experience they may have gone through that has shaped the way that they are and they work and they think today. So with that said, I want to just finish off with a small quote that I think summarizes my presentation in a way that allows you to understand the importance of the topic. So what it says, if you can't speak the language of other generations, you can't sell to them, work with them, influence them, or convince them to support your cause. So it's important to, just going back to my previous slide, avoid the stereotyping, be flexible and accommodating, tailor your communication skills, don't overlook the similarities between your peers, and establish that respect in order to be able to attract all types of audiences. Thank you so much for listening. I'm not sure how we're on time.
We are good on time, so we have 15 minutes left if someone wants to raise a question. So I found this presentation very, very interesting. Thanks very much, Marta. And yeah, and I think it's actually we are meeting other generations at our daily work every day, and yeah, you never think about what's in their mind. And yes, so this is really helpful to understand sometimes the behavior of the other ones, right? So, I mean, I'm in a different generation as you are, so that was also very interesting for me. I will not say which generation I am. So, if anyone of the audience wants to raise a hand, then I can allow you to speak. If or you can write it in the chat. If not, Marta, you can show your survey, which you mentioned in the beginning.
Yeah, so my survey isn't finished, but I can read out some questions of it if you'd like to hear it. I was planning on sending it out to everyone.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is totally fine as well. So if the audience
because, they're simple questions, so I feel like if they can't be answered, it won't entirely work. So maybe if we can send it out this week, I'd love to hear some opinions from people who have listened to the presentation and know a little more about the topic.
Yes, this is okay. This is a good idea. So send it to me and I can provide it to the people.
Okay, perfect.
All right. So if there is any question, please write it in the chat or raise your hands through the Zoom platform, and then I can allow you to speak. So, and if there are any questions for today, then that's all I have to say is thank you very much for being here.
Thank you very much for having me.
Yeah, it was a really interesting topic. And of course, this recording will be provided at the SAP community page about the community calls. And then I hope everyone will be able to listen to it. And if there are any questions, it's also possible to write an email to community@sap.com. So you are able to get a feedback on any question you have here. And I will post the link in the chat here as well, where you can find the presentations and all the upcoming SAP community calls. So thank you very much, Marta. I will stop recording. I hope we will keep in contact, and all the best for you. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much. All the best.